Please, it's rubbing against it. Let's see what the rancher did that shocked the whole town.
Caleb Turner was known in his small town as a quiet man who preferred actions over words.
He lived just outside town where the fields stretched wide and the air always smelled fresh. His ranch was not the biggest, but it was well cared for. People trusted him because he treated both animals and people with patience and respect.
He rarely attended social events unless someone truly needed help.
Because of this, many people saw him as dependable, but also a bit mysterious.
That Saturday afternoon, the town was busier than usual.
The annual livestock fair had brought farmers, families, and visitors from nearby areas. Children ran around excitedly. Vendors sold snacks, and the sounds of animals mixed with cheerful conversation. Caleb had only come to deliver some supplies and check on a friend's horse. He planned to leave quietly once his small task was done. As he walked near one of the animal enclosures, he noticed a group forming. At first, he ignored it.
Crowds often gathered at fairs for small reasons, sometimes curiosity, sometimes gossip. But then he heard a worried voice rise above the chatter.
Please, it's rubbing against it. Something isn't right, Bray. The voice sounded anxious, almost desperate. The tone reminded him of times when animals showed discomfort, but people didn't recognize the signs. He moved closer, not pushing anyone aside, just observing. A young woman stood near a fenced area, clearly nervous. Her hands were slightly shaking, and she kept looking at the animal inside the enclosure. A few people nearby whispered to each other, trying to guess what she meant. Some seemed confused, others concerned, but no one stepped forward immediately. Caleb finally spoke in his usual calm tone. He asked her what exactly she had noticed. His voice wasn't loud, yet it carried enough confidence that the nearby chatter softened.
She explained that the animal had been restless for a while.
Best. It kept brushing against part of the fence and shifting uneasily. She feared it might hurt itself if the problem wasn't understood soon. Her words came out quickly, showing how worried she was. Caleb nodded slowly. He had spent years around animals and knew that discomfort often appeared through small behaviors first. Sometimes people misunderstood those signs, and simple issues could grow serious if ignored. He didn't jump to conclusions. Instead, he approached carefully so the animal wouldn't become more stressed. The crowd watched with growing interest.
Some expected drama, others just wanted to see what would happen.
Small towns often turn simple moments into big conversations. Caleb knew this but focused only on the task in front of him. He observed the animal's movements, posture, and breathing. Nothing looked alarming at first glance, but he noticed subtle tension. The animal shifted weight repeatedly and seemed irritated by something not immediately visible. Caleb spoke softly, the way experienced ranchers often do. The animal gradually became calmer just hearing a steady voice. The young woman watched closely. Relief started to replace her panic, but she still looked uncertain. Caleb reassured her gently that she did the right thing by speaking up. Ignoring discomfort never helps, he said. Awareness is always the first step. A few people nearby exchanged glances. Some seemed surprised that he treated the situation so seriously. Others began to realize that what sounded strange at first might actually be important. Caleb crouched slightly to examine the area more carefully. Bill.
Years of ranch work had taught him patience. Quick assumptions often led to mistakes.
He checked for anything that might cause irritation. Equipment, surroundings, even small environmental factors. As he worked, the crowd grew quieter.
Even children seemed to sense the seriousness. The fair noises continued in the background, but around that enclosure attention was focused on Caleb's calm, steady approach. Someone whispered that Caleb always knew what to do with animals. Another person mentioned how he once helped a neighbor's injured horse recover when no one else noticed the problem early enough. Stories like that had quietly built his reputation over the years. The young woman admitted she had hesitated before asking for help. She worried people might misunderstand her concern or think she was exaggerating.
Caleb told her that speaking up was always better than staying silent when something felt wrong.
Gradually, the tension eased. The animal seemed less restless as Caleb adjusted its surroundings slightly. But though he hadn't announced any conclusions yet, his presence alone appeared reassuring. Some townspeople began discussing how easily misunderstandings start. A few had assumed something completely different when they first heard the woman's worried words. Now they realized how quickly assumptions could spread without facts. Caleb stood up slowly, still thoughtful. He explained that he wanted to observe a little longer before deciding anything. Patience, he said, often prevents bigger problems later. His words carried quiet authority, not arrogance.
The fair organizer eventually approached, thanking Caleb for stepping in. Safety and animal welfare were important to the event's reputation.
Caleb simply nodded, avoiding attention as usual. As the sun began lowering in the sky, a softer light covered the fairgrounds.
The earlier tension had turned into calm curiosity. People didn't disperse immediately. They seemed interested not in drama anymore, but in understanding. For Caleb, this moment felt familiar.
Ranch life often involved reading silent signals, small changes in behavior, mood, or environment.
But those who rushed often missed what mattered. The young woman's shoulders finally relaxed. She thanked him quietly. Caleb reminded her again that caring attention makes a big difference. Sometimes the smallest observations prevent the biggest troubles. Whispers in the crowd shifted from confusion to respect. Some people realized they had judged the situation too quickly. Others simply appreciated seeing calm problem-solving instead of panic. As evening approached, Caleb stayed a little longer than planned. Something about the situation told him it wasn't fully resolved yet. But experience had taught him to trust that instinct. No one knew then that this small moment, a worried voice, a restless animal, and a rancher's calm response would soon become one of the town's most talked-about stories. What began as confusion was slowly turning into something deeper, something that would challenge assumptions and bring unexpected lessons to everyone watching. And Caleb, though he didn't seek attention, was already at the center of it. Caleb crouched beside the restless animal, a large, gentle horse that had been pacing and brushing against the fence for some time. The young woman stood close by, her hands twisting nervously, unsure if she had done the right thing by asking for help.
Caleb spoke softly to the horse, letting his voice carry calmness. "It's okay. I've got you," he said, though not loudly enough to startle anyone around. Slowly, he reached out to examine the horse's coat and the straps of its harness. At first glance, nothing seemed wrong. The straps looked normal, the saddle in place, the fencing undamaged.
But Caleb's trained eyes noticed small details. The harness rubbed slightly against a tender patch behind the horse's shoulder. It wasn't visible to most people, but the animal's subtle movements revealed discomfort. Caleb understood immediately that the horse wasn't dangerous or aggressive. It was simply trying to communicate its pain in the only way it could. He gently adjusted the harness, making sure it wouldn't chafe the horse's skin. The horse flinched at first, but slowly stood more still as Caleb's hands moved carefully, deliberately. He spoke softly the entire time, letting the animal know it was safe. The young woman exhaled deeply, relief beginning to replace her anxiety. She had been so worried, unsure if the horse might injure itself or if she had misread the signs. Seeing Caleb's calm approach reassured her more than words could. People in the small crowd that had gathered began to watch more closely. Some had expected a dramatic event, a horse running wild, someone panicking, perhaps even an accident. But instead, they saw patience, focus, and quiet expertise.
Caleb didn't rush. He didn't raise his voice.
He simply observed, understood, and acted with care. Finally, after a few minutes, the horse stopped its restless behavior. It lowered its head and seemed to sigh, a soft sound of relief that only someone familiar with horses could recognize. Caleb smiled faintly and patted the animal's neck. "There we go," he said. "All better now." The young woman blinked, almost in disbelief. She had been so frightened moments ago, yet now everything seemed calm. The tension in her shoulders eased, and she whispered a heartfelt,
"Thank you."
People began to realize that the situation wasn't as alarming as they had imagined. Their assumptions, fueled by worry and curiosity, had painted a much more dramatic picture than reality. The horse had not been in danger of harming anyone, and yet their imaginations had taken over. Caleb's calm, methodical approach had diffused the situation without anyone realizing it until the moment passed. A few onlookers approached Caleb afterward, asking questions. "How did you know what was wrong?" one man asked, admiration in his voice. Caleb shrugged lightly. "You learn to notice the signs," he said. "Animals tell you when something is wrong."
You just have to pay attention. The young woman stayed close, still watching Caleb work.
She asked, "How do you stay so calm? I was panicking and I didn't even know what to do." Rasp.
Caleb looked at her, his expression kind. Panic doesn't help, he explained.
Calm observation does. If you're worried, slow down and look carefully. Sometimes what seems serious isn't, and sometimes what seems small is actually important. As Caleb helped remove the harness for adjustment, the horse shifted its weight again, but this time it was in response to a small irritation that Caleb could easily fix. He adjusted the strap, rubbed the horse's shoulder gently, and stepped back. The horse immediately relaxed, lowering its head and giving a soft nicker as if expressing thanks. People around the enclosure started to nod quietly to themselves. They had been ready to gossip or speculate, perhaps even judge, but now they watched with respect. Some whispered about how calm and experienced Caleb was. Others noted that he hadn't sought attention. He didn't boast or demand recognition. He simply did what needed to be done. The young woman began to smile, her nerves settling further. I thought something terrible was going to happen, she said softly. I didn't know who to call or what to do. Caleb smiled faintly. You did exactly what you were supposed to do, he said. You spoke up.
You noticed. That's the first step.
Without that, the problem could have grown. A few children nearby, who had been watching quietly, began asking questions too. They had never seen someone handle an animal so patiently.
Caleb crouched again and demonstrated in a safe way how to approach an animal that seemed distressed.
He spoke gently, showing how body language, calm voices, and slow movements could make a huge difference. Parents of the children watched silently, impressed by his teaching instinct. This wasn't part of any scheduled event at the fair. This was Caleb noticing a problem and turning it into a moment of learning for everyone around. By the time he finished adjusting the harness and checking the horse thoroughly, the crowd had grown quieter, more attentive, more thoughtful. Some of the older ranchers in the crowd whispered to each other. They had known Caleb for years, but had never seen him demonstrate his skills in such a public way.
A few admitted they had underestimated him, assuming his quiet demeanor meant he was less capable. Now they were reconsidering. Respect had a way of quietly spreading, and it often started with small, unnoticed actions. Bay. Caleb stepped back and gave the horse one last gentle pat. "All done," he said. The horse nickered softly, calm now, and walked a few steps with ease. The young woman exhaled, relief washing over her face. People clapped quietly, not out of ceremony, but because they genuinely appreciated the quiet way the problem had been solved. Afterward, the young woman lingered, asking Caleb for advice. She wanted to know how to notice early signs of distress in animals, how to prevent small problems from becoming big ones. Caleb spoke in simple, practical terms, explaining how observation, patience, and understanding body language made all the difference. He shared small tips that anyone could use, even those with no experience. As the afternoon sun began to lower, shadows stretched across the fairgrounds. Bay. Caleb finally prepared to leave, but the crowd had changed. People weren't just curious anymore. They were thoughtful, quietly reconsidering assumptions, realizing the importance of observation and care. Caleb's calm action had shifted the mood from panic to understanding. Even as he walked away, people continued to talk about the horse and the quiet rancher who had solved the problem. Some spoke in hushed tones, others more openly, but all recognized that something unusual had happened. Caleb hadn't sought recognition. He hadn't tried to make the situation dramatic. He simply noticed, acted with care, and taught by example. The young woman stayed for a few more moments, watching him disappear among the fair stalls. She felt grateful, inspired, and more confident in her own ability to speak up in the future. Something small and tense had turned into a lesson she would remember. And though most people had only seen part of what Caleb had done, that quiet afternoon would become one of the town's small but unforgettable stories. The day a calm, thoughtful rancher turned a confusing, worrying moment into a quiet lesson in patience, care, and understanding. The next morning, Caleb returned to his ranch earlier than usual. Though he usually liked quiet mornings alone, he couldn't stop thinking about the previous day at the fair. The horse he had helped was calm now, but the memory of the young woman's worry lingered. More than that, he couldn't ignore how quickly the crowd had formed, how fast rumors and assumptions could spread. It made him realize that even small moments could affect people in ways he didn't expect.
Caleb moved among his animals, checking their health and making sure everything was as it should be.
He knew that ranch life demanded attention to small details. A loose strap, an irritated animal, a distracted worker. Anything could create problems if not noticed early. As he worked, he thought about how he could help others understand the importance of observation and care.
He had solved yesterday's problem quietly, but maybe it could become a lesson for the whole town. By mid-morning, he decided to act.
He called the young woman who had approached him at the fair, asking if she could meet him at the edge of the ranch where there was space for demonstration. When she arrived, Caleb greeted her warmly, noting that she still seemed slightly nervous. She explained that she wanted to learn more about taking care of animals, not just for herself, but for the community. Caleb smiled faintly. He liked teaching, especially when it helped others gain confidence and awareness. He led her to a small fenced area where some of his horses grazed. One horse, younger and less trained than the one at the fair, seemed restless. Caleb explained that this animal would help demonstrate how to notice early signs of discomfort. He spoke calmly, describing behaviors to watch for. Shifting weight, rubbing against fences, uneven breathing, small ticks in movement. The young woman listened closely, absorbing every word. As Caleb worked, he explained that patience was key. Rushing could make animals anxious, or even dangerous. Small adjustments, gentle touches, calm voices, these were all tools that made a big difference. The young woman tried to follow his instructions, moving slowly, speaking softly, and observing the horse's reactions. At first, she was unsure, but Caleb's steady presence reassured her. Step by step, she began to notice things she had never seen before. Subtle movements, small reactions that signaled discomfort or stress. Word about Caleb's morning demonstration began to spread. Neighbors and some ranchers who had been at the fair the day before came to watch. They were curious, but respectful, not crowding too close. People whispered to each other, amazed at how calm and methodical Caleb was. Some admitted they had underestimated him in the past. Quiet, unassuming, but full of skill and knowledge. A man who didn't boast but whose actions spoke louder than words ever could. Caleb used this opportunity to teach practical skills. He showed how to adjust equipment, check for irritation, and approach animals without startling them. He explained why small signs, a shift in weight, a flick of the tail, a subtle nicker, could indicate a larger problem if ignored. People nodded, realizing how little they had paid attention before. Some took notes mentally. Others whispered to friends about the importance of observation.
As the morning passed, Caleb began to organize a small demonstration for the whole community. He wanted everyone to see that careful, patient handling prevented problems before they became serious.
He asked neighbors to bring any animals they were concerned about, and soon a small group gathered, eager to learn. Horses, goats, and even a few cows were brought in for demonstrations.
Caleb guided people through each situation, showing how to adjust equipment, recognize stress signs, and calm nervous animals. The young woman who had first asked for help at the fair now assisted him, helping others understand what to look for.
Her confidence grew with each explanation. She smiled as people began to listen and follow instructions.
What had started as a moment of worry and panic had now become a teaching opportunity. Caleb watched quietly, satisfied. Breath. His goal was never recognition. It was awareness and prevention.
Some town elders approached him, curious and slightly skeptical at first.
They had known Caleb for years, but seeing him handle so many animals and people with patience impressed them. They asked questions, seeking advice on how to implement these practices on their own ranches. Caleb spoke clearly and simply, showing that anyone could improve their skills with observation, care, and attention to detail. By noon, the demonstration had grown larger than expected. Families, neighbors, and ranchers alike were engaged. People watched quietly, asked questions, and learned practical methods for animal care. A few children even tried following Caleb's guidance under careful supervision. Their laughter and curiosity added warmth to the scene. The atmosphere was no longer tense. It was alive with learning and understanding.
At one point, Caleb paused and addressed the whole group. "Animals tell us what they need," he said.
Burrs. We just have to notice. The smallest signs can prevent the biggest problems. Patience and attention are more valuable than speed or strength. If you watch, listen, and act with care, you'll prevent accidents and make your animals happier and healthier. Breaths. His words resonated with the crowd. People began to nod and murmur agreement, realizing how simple actions could make such a huge difference. By afternoon, the town's curiosity had shifted to admiration. People who had initially judged or whispered about the horse at the fair now approached Caleb with respect. Some shared their own stories of small mistakes or overlooked problems, and Caleb listened patiently, giving guidance. His quiet leadership began to influence the community in ways he hadn't anticipated. Even the young woman who had first seemed anxious and unsure had transformed. She was now confidently explaining techniques to a small group of neighbors. Caleb watched her with a faint smile, recognizing how powerful encouragement and guidance could be.
She had learned more than animal care. She had learned patience, observation, and confidence.
As the sun began to lower in the sky, Caleb finally concluded the demonstration. People lingered, asking last questions, expressing gratitude, and discussing what they had learned.
A small crowd had become a community lesson, all sparked by one anxious call for help and the quiet skill of a patient rancher. Caleb returned to his home as the evening settled over the ranch.
The day had been long, filled with teaching, demonstrations, and conversations. Yet, he felt a quiet satisfaction. What had begun as a small moment of worry had grown into a positive experience for the entire town. People had learned to observe, to act carefully, and to listen, not just to animals, but to each other. That evening, as he sat on his porch watching the sun dip below the hills, Caleb reflected on the events of the past 2 days. The town had seen his skills, but more importantly, they had seen patience, understanding, and quiet leadership. He hadn't sought recognition, and yet he had earned it. Not through words, but through action, care, and a willingness to step forward when needed. Parrot. And deep down, Caleb knew that this was only the beginning. The lesson he had shared, the calm approach he had modeled, would ripple through the town in ways no one could predict. A single act of careful attention had grown into something far bigger, a shift in awareness, respect, and understanding. For the young woman, the town, and even himself, this day marked a turning point. What started as worry and confusion had transformed into trust, learning, and quiet admiration. And Caleb, the rancher who never sought attention, had once again reminded everyone that true leadership often speaks in silence, patience, and thoughtful action. The following morning, the town seemed different. Word of Caleb's calm handling of the restless horse and his demonstration the day before had spread quickly. People whispered about the quiet rancher who had solved what everyone had assumed was a big problem, teaching the town an unexpected lesson in patience, observation, and care. Neighbors looked at him with newfound respect, children waved as he passed, and even some older ranchers nodded silently, as if acknowledging a wisdom they had not fully appreciated before. Caleb, however, went about his day as usual, though. He moved around his ranch, feeding animals, checking fences, and repairing equipment. He did not seek recognition, nor did he expect anyone to praise him. His satisfaction came from knowing that the animals were safe and the community had learned something valuable. Still, he couldn't deny that a small sense of pride had begun to settle in. By late morning, a group of town leaders approached Caleb. They had spoken with the fair organizers, the ranchers, and even the young woman he had helped. They wanted to discuss ways to improve animal care standards in the community. It was unusual for people to approach him formally. Most had been content to admire from a distance. But Caleb listened quietly, nodding as they spoke. The discussion was practical but meaningful.
They asked about training programs for new ranchers, better safety measures at fairs, and community workshops on animal welfare.
Caleb suggested demonstrations like the one he had done the day before, small hands-on lessons where people could see and practice careful handling.
He also emphasized teaching observation, patience, and communication with animals.
It's not just about equipment or fences, he said.
It's about noticing what your animals need and acting before small problems grow. The leaders nodded, impressed by his simple but effective approach.
They promised to organize workshops, create community guidelines for animal care, and include educational sessions at future fairs. For Caleb, this was unexpected.
He had acted quietly, without thinking of recognition, and yet his actions had sparked change. Meanwhile, word of Caleb's expertise had spread beyond the town. Nearby ranchers, curious about the story, began visiting to see how he handled his animals. Some brought horses, cows, or goats to learn directly from him. Caleb welcomed them, guiding each visitor with calm patience. His teaching was hands-on but gentle, focusing on observation, understanding, and early problem prevention. People who had once assumed he was reserved or distant now respected him for his knowledge, humility, and quiet leadership.
Back at the ranch, the young woman who had first asked for help continued to visit Bay.
Her confidence grew with each lesson. She began sharing what she had learned with others, helping neighbors notice early signs of distress in animals and teaching them simple steps to prevent injuries or discomfort. Bad. Her nervousness from the fair seemed long forgotten. She had become a teacher in her own right, inspired by Caleb's example. The community began to change. People became more aware of their animals, more willing to listen, and more ready to act when small signs appeared. Rumors and assumptions were replaced with observation and careful thought.
Even children learned to notice subtle cues, asking questions, watching closely, and practicing gentle interactions.
The town had slowly transformed, not through orders or rules, but through a quiet demonstration of patience, care, and understanding. Caleb continued his daily routines, but now with visitors and learners around him more often. Some mornings were spent adjusting harnesses, checking horses, or demonstrating techniques. Other days involved discussions with ranchers about animal welfare, training methods, and safety improvements at events. Caleb's calm presence set the tone. He did not raise his voice. He did not demand attention. And he never acted as if he were superior. Yet people listened, learned, and respected him. As weeks passed, the town noticed subtle but meaningful improvements. Fairs became safer and more organized. Animals were healthier, less stressed, and better cared for. Neighbors worked together to teach each other about proper equipment, observation, and handling techniques. The young woman, now more confident than ever, became a symbol of the change Caleb had sparked. People spoke about her and Caleb as examples of leadership through patience and care. One evening, as Caleb sat on his porch watching the sunset behind the hills, he reflected on everything that had happened. A simple moment of a horse rubbing against a fence, a worried young woman, and his calm response had turned into something bigger than he had imagined. He realized that action, patience, and understanding, even without drama or attention, could influence an entire community. He felt satisfied, not because of recognition, but because the town and its animals were safer, calmer, and more aware. The young woman approached him quietly, carrying a notebook filled with notes from the workshops and lessons. Caleb, she said softly. I just wanted to thank you again. You didn't just help the horse. You taught me, and now I can help others. I feel like I can make a difference too. Caleb nodded. You've done well, he said. Remember, patience and attention matter more than speed or strength. If you watch, listen, and act carefully, you'll make a difference every day. The town continued to speak about Caleb's actions long after the fair and demonstrations. People remembered him as the rancher who had quietly solved a confusing moment, taught important lessons, and inspired change without ever seeking praise. Children spoke about what they had learned, neighbors adjusted their routines, and the community grew closer and more responsible. Caleb returned to his usual work, tending to animals and managing his ranch. But life remained simple, peaceful, and fulfilling. Yet the quiet influence he had sparked continued to grow, carried by the people he had taught and the small but meaningful changes they implemented. But what had begun as a single moment, a horse rubbing against a fence and a young woman's concern, had grown into a story of learning, patience, and community care.
As the sun disappeared behind the horizon, Caleb looked over his ranch, satisfied.
He didn't need applause, recognition, or fame. The lessons had been shared, the animals were safe, and the town had become a better place because someone had noticed, cared, and acted with patience. And in that quiet satisfaction, Caleb knew he had made a lasting difference. The story of the calm rancher who handled a worried moment with care became part of the town's memory, not as a dramatic event, but as a quiet lesson in observation, patience, and responsibility. It reminded everyone that small actions, taken with understanding and thoughtfulness, could create change far greater than anyone expected. And so Caleb continued his days quietly on the ranch, watching, teaching, and helping, knowing that true leadership often spoke in silence, careful attention, and consistent care. The town had learned, the animals were safer, and life had been made just a little better. All because one rancher chose to notice, act, and teach when it mattered most.